Tonight is our 14th class of our Orthodox Survival course. We've completed the section on the 12th and 13th centuries, this all-important time of transition from the first millennium orthodoxy that was shared by East and West to what in the West was really a different religion, whole different outlook. So tonight we'll begin our section on the Renaissance, which for convenience's sake we will say lasts roughly from 1300 to 1600. Now, of course, many conventional timelines show the 14th and 15th centuries as the late Middle Ages. For example, some people will say, well, the Middle Ages don't end till the defeat of Richard III at Bosworth in the 1470s, or arbitrary things like that. Of course, all of these cutoff points are somewhat arbitrary. There are reasons for this, especially if you're considering the British Isles and the Iberian Peninsula, Spain and Portugal, in Scandinavia, which remained medieval, so to speak, in many ways, longer than the dynamic Italian and French cultures, which are the seedbeds and exemplars of all future European development. But for our purposes, since we are working on acquiring an orthodox overview of the vast sweep of Western culture, it's most useful to zero in on the 14th century for our start, to begin, and on Italy, as the key period and the key place marking the transition into the Renaissance. And remember, when we're talking about intellectual histories, we're always talking about the history of the elite. Right? So-called medieval ways, or medieval outlooks, went right on in Western Europe right up until our own time. I would have to say, to some extent, my own grandparents in rural Louisiana still had, to a great extent, a medieval outlook, as opposed to intellectuals or the sophisticated elites living back in France. So it's not like all of Christian or all medieval culture just ended in Western Europe and they all became secular, or they all became humanists. When we talk about intellectual history, we're talking about the ideas and the cultural changes created by the elites, which gradually work their way down and to a greater or lesser extent affect the ordinary people. But unfortunately, the bad changes do affect ordinary people, and take them away from truth, take them away from their ancestral ways, take them away from legitimate traditions. Okay. In my earlier proposal for a syllabus of Part 2 of our course, for that, see the end of the notes for Class 10. Originally, I put forward the Reformation and Counter-Reformation as separate topics, but after further reflection, I've decided that we'll treat them as subtopics within this whole Renaissance period. Okay. As with our earlier sessions, I'm not sure how long we're going to take on the Renaissance. Okay. Right now, you're here with me in initially forming our course. We're creating our course right now as we go along, and so we're going to take things as they come, and we'll adjust it as we see fit. Okay. Though, as we said earlier, the real transition in the West from orthodoxy to something else, really took place in the 12th to the 13th centuries, yet the consequences of this transition were probably not foreseen by the men who caused it. Men who believed, tragically and mistakenly, but believed that they were laying solid foundations for something like a 1,000-year Reich, so to speak, of a genuine Christian civilization under the benevolent rule of the Pope. Okay? But that was not, in fact, what happened. That was not the result. Right after this period, right after their glorious 13th century in the Renaissance, we're going to see with dismay shockingly different consequences of the ideas of the Western High Middle Ages. We're going to see the collapse of the delicate idealistic, to use Sorokin's term, which that terminology that we introduced a little while ago. This delicate idealistic synthesis of the High Middle Ages into an open, unapologetic, self-adulating, no-holds-barred sensate culture, marked by anthropocentrism rather than theocentrism, centered on man, not on God. That's the Renaissance, right? Centered on man, not on God. The shift from truth to power as the driving force of culture and politics. You're asking about Machiavelli. There he is, right there, right? Superstition replacing faith and reason, right? The Middle Ages were not the age of faith and the Renaissance age of reason. The Middle Ages were the age of faith and reason, and the Renaissance is the age of superstition. Okay? The Renaissance also involves the glorification of carnal passions, right? The elevation of the individual, his quest for human glory, and being praised for questing for glory, right? They look up to him for going for glory. Right? And the misdirection, and this is very important for us, okay? The misdirection of science from its ancient pursuit of truth in the service of man's spiritual and intellectual telos, his goal, his fulfillment, right? Which is virtue. Remember, even Aristotle said, you don't know a man is happy till he's dead, right? Because you don't know if someone's happy till they've attained their telos, their purpose. And the purpose of man is the acquisition of virtue. So you can look back, once someone has died, you can look back in their life and say, was it a happy life? Did they attain virtue? So even the pagans, the better pagans, recognize that the purpose of man in life is not to manipulate the world around him, or not to acquire wealth, or not to acquire power, but to acquire virtue. Okay? And science, the true goal of science, true goal of scholarship, was first of all contemplation, that is to conform the mind to truth, and then conform the will to the mind, and thereby acquire virtue. Okay? And only secondarily then are scientific discoveries used to create technology to make the burden of our life easier on earth, which is a worthwhile goal, but it's a secondary goal. Okay? Material pursuits, material possessions, material achievements are secondary instruments of virtue, so that man does not become discouraged, so that we can help our brother. But they are not the primary pursuit, or the primary purpose, rather, of science, which is contemplation of truth, right? In the pursuit of virtue. And I'm talking now about the level of the pagan philosophers. I'm not even talking yet about Christianity. Okay? And the Holy Fathers take this and they bring it even to a higher level. Okay? But what happens in the Renaissance, okay, is that science is misdirected, and it's misdirected by very specific people. We're going to talk about who they are. We're going to talk about when it happened and how it happened. It's not a secret, right? It's not something you read about on conspiracy websites. It's well known in the historical record. Okay? The misdirection of science from its ancient pursuit of truth in the service of man's spiritual, intellectual telos, which is virtue, right, to the progressive, quote-unquote, pursuit of power over material phenomena, right? Manipulating the natural world outside of us in the service of comfort and pleasure, and the manipulation of the masses of the people by a self-serving oligarchy of occult insiders, the people in charge, who are now controlling the direction of science in the pursuit of power. Okay? And this vast technological enterprise, and it has been, one way to look at the history of Western man since 1400 or 1500 is a vast technological enterprise, right, of greater and greater control over nature and acquisition of material wealth, and greater techniques and instrumentalities and institutions for controlling large masses of people. Okay. So, and this vast technological enterprise is funded by this alchemy, right? This forbidden science of usury-based finances. And we're going to talk about that too, and where usury, where making money out of money comes in, and how that's related to a magical, forbidden philosophy, occult philosophy of life. Okay, so the Renaissance is like this. Imagine one of those vast yet delicate Gothic cathedrals. Okay, so let's take our symbol of the 13th century, of the Europe of Aquinas, the Europe of St. Louis of King of France, the Europe that the Western Church is so proud of, that they point back to as the greatest time, right? The time of the Gothic cathedrals, the popes being in all their glory, and Western Europe having this great unity, this res publica Christiana, right? So think of this vast Gothic cathedral as being a symbol of that, the achievement of that era. Okay, it's this cathedral that's so heartbreakingly beautiful. Okay, in its dynamic upward thrust to pierce the heavens with its great spires, right? But suddenly it gets dizzy and it loses its dynamic balance and collapses into a pile of rubble. Because remember, as we said last week, the Gothic cathedral is no longer, as Christopher Dawson says, it's no longer a building, it's a machine. The Gothic cathedral is held, there are these vast frames of stone holding up hundreds of yards of stained glass. Okay, so it's vast, it's huge, but it's delicate. It's held together by very precise engineering measures. So the pointed arch, where the arch goes from being very stable, from being a semicircle at the top and being rounded, right, and being stable, to being in dynamic tension with the pointed arch. So it enables greater verticality, but it's in constant dynamic tension. It has to be held very precisely in place. Okay, and then these great walls of the Gothic cathedrals which are actually again made of stone and are vast and appear to be so solid, but are actually very delicate frameworks that are being held up by what? By the flying buttress.
It's also about this thick.
The buttresses, yes, big buttresses coming from the outside and holding it up. Okay, that's why when you look at you're sitting in Paris, you're looking over the Seine at Notre Dame. Looks like the back of it looks like a giant spider there, because those buttresses are holding up the famous apse of Notre Dame. So it's really, as Christopher Dawson says, the Gothic cathedral is a machine. It's no longer in stasis. It's no longer a building that's solidly on the ground, but it's a dynamic, constantly in tension. It is constantly in a dynamic tension to stay together. So it's a brilliant achievement, but philosophically, conceptually, and even in engineering terms, it represents a step away from stability into dynamism and into constant struggle, right, to stay in place. Okay. So, and that image right there gives you an idea of the transition from Orthodoxy into what we call Catholicism, or into so-called Western Christianity. Okay. But imagine this great cathedral suddenly getting dizzy and losing its balance and collapsing into a pile of rubble, which actually did happen often in the building of these cathedrals. You know, they didn't get it quite right and it would collapse. Okay. Meanwhile, now while that's happening, the undynamic and unprogressive older brother of the Gothic cathedral, that old-fashioned boring Byzantine church, just sitting solidly on the ground, okay, a real building just sitting on the ground. This symbolizes our Orthodox civilization. Right? And that old church is just staying there, silent, still, unchanged, left behind in the march of progress. Okay? Quietly living on in the monasteries and agrarian societies in the vast backwaters at the eastern end of the Western world. Remember, Eastern Europe, including European Russia, and including also, in our world is really also Asia Minor and the Levant. This is actually much larger, much more populous in Western Europe at this time. Okay? And this whole vast old Christian civilization, even though it's under the Turks, or even though the Russians have not yet developed very much in terms of material culture, it's this vast silent reality just going on, where all this noise and all this innovation and all this dynamism is going on in the West. Okay, so our world, the world of the Balkans, the world of the Levant, of Asia Minor, the world of the Ottoman Empire, or our ancestors, our people came from, and the world of old Russia, right? Russia before Peter the Great. This Orthodox life is just going right on, just like that old church, just standing there solid, okay, with its round arches and its dome, and its noble simplicity, right? So the headlong, frenzied race into passion and fragmentation that was initiated by the Renaissance will be, as we're going to see later on, it's going to be temporarily arrested by the attempt of the Enlightenment, roughly the 17th and 18th centuries, okay, to create a new stasis, a new standing still, by means of reason. They're saying, whoa, let's all this dynamism, all this change, all this movement, let's slow down, let's get everything corralled by reason. Okay? So that's the era of what? Of the beautiful music we were just talking about before class, right? Of Bach's music, the era of Newtonian physics, okay? The era in English literature, the era of Restoration poetry, and so forth. The era of the philosophical ideas that led to the American, not necessarily the French, but the American Revolution. Okay. So they're trying to create a new stasis, a new stability by means of reason, but this being merely man-made, without spiritual truth, without power, without repentance, okay, still marked by great hubris. Okay, this brittle, make-believe, reasonable world of Newtonian science and rationalist philosophy is going to be crushed into 1,000 pieces by the demonic power of revolution, okay, which comes in 1789 with the French Revolution. Okay, and as this really initiates the period in 1789 is this red letter in a bad sense, not a good sense red letter, but a bad sense, the red of blood, right? A red letter year that initiates the period we still live in. Okay, so during these last two periods, Enlightenment and Revolution, at that time now, the Orthodox East will once again encounter and be affected, to some extent greatly affected in different places, right, by Western European man. And the latter's bad ideas will have consequences for our fathers as well. And start affecting the Orthodox countries, the Orthodox peoples. It is essential to our survival as Orthodox so we understand what happened at that time to the Orthodox peoples, leading right up to our time. We're Orthodox, but to a very great extent, we're just like the Western people too, right? Because we lived so much in the civilization that they created with their ideas, and many achievements, but also many mistakes, especially spiritual and intellectual mistakes. And so we're going to start talking about some of those mistakes right now. So we're going to start with our topic 1 on the Renaissance. We're going to have several topics under the Renaissance. Tonight's topic is some key bad ideas right from the start. And some of these ideas are inherited right from the High Middle Ages, but they crystallize in the 14th century. Especially what we're going to learn is nominalism, and also the rejection of St. Gregory Palamas's teaching on the essence and the energies of God and the knowability of God. Let's talk about that. So we're going to see that bad ideas in the High Middle Ages led to even worse things in the Renaissance. Okay? But I'd like to go back and review 3 key transitional ideas that we have alluded to or spoken about in passing when we were talking about the Middle Ages. And these ideas led inevitably to the collapse of that delicate idealistic structure of 13th century Western Christian culture into this fragmented free-for-all of the Renaissance, this unraveling, this wild period of innovation. I call them the 3 pancakes, okay? Because each one involves pancaking. You know what pancaking is, right? Things that collapse and smushed into one piece. You know, like, for example, I'm sure you've seen over and over again videos from 9/11 when the World Trade Center collapsed, right? Just pancaked. Which is why many sensible people, and much less engineers looking at it, say it must have been a controlled demolition, right? Because of the way it collapsed so neatly.
It kind of should have toppled over the other way.
Yeah.
The plane would have hit it.
It would have hit, yes. So anyway, I don't want to get into 9/11 theories, but I'm using it as an image of pancaking. Okay, so pancaking is when things that are really separate or in a stack get smashed into one thing. Okay, so in the West they smash things together that shouldn't be smashed together. And I want to talk about 3 key areas: about man, about the church, and about God. Okay. So pancake 1, man, the distinction of reason and nous, the distinction of soul and spirit. The scholastics and what became Roman Catholic, to use a modern term. By the way, the term Roman Catholic was invented in the 19th century by Anglicans. The Catholics never called themselves Roman Catholic, they just called themselves Catholics. And then in the 19th century, there was a revival in the Church of England of people who wanted the Anglicans to be called the Catholics. So they started calling the Papists the Roman Catholics, and they called themselves the English Catholics, even though they're actually Protestants, or the Anglicans. So that's a little footnote. So the scholastics, and what became Roman Catholic anthropology generally, do not distinguish carefully between the logos in man, okay, regarded as diania, our discursive analytical intellect, the intellect we use, right, to do mathematics, to do science, to do ordinary studies, to our ordinary day-to-day thinking, right? And the logos regarded as nous, the synthetic, intuitive, and properly speaking, spiritual intellect. So the Greek fathers and the consensus of Orthodox teaching is that we really have the spiritual intellect, which is quite distinct from our Dianetic intellect, from our day-to-day analytic intellect. And this nous was what was closed up at the time of the fall and was unable then to communicate directly with God and with spiritual realities. Okay. And it's opened up again by baptism to perceive spiritual things, and by perceiving spiritual things accurately, then this enables also the Dianetic intellect to perceive even material things, or non-divine things more accurately. Okay? But the Western thinkers start pancaking these into one reality, or rather, they never advance to a more, or they never go back and read the Greek fathers and figure out that there's really a difference here. You see, so they pancake them into one reality, reason, which they just call reason. Ratio is one of the Latin words. Intellectus is another word. Now, sometimes you see ratio or mens, perhaps being applied to the discoursive intellect, and sometimes intellectus to what we would call the nous. But they really don't make that careful a distinction. Okay. Now, another word for one's nous, our nous, is our pneuma, our spirit, regarded as the highest faculty of the psyche, of the soul. Okay. And with its own distinctive function, the spirit is to act in the invisible realm of the angelic universe through direct, undiluted, if you're baptized, if you're in the church, if you're leaving the spiritual life, if you're following the directions of the Holy Fathers, and confessing, and you're humble, right? Then your nous will function, your pneuma, or nous, will function to have direct, undiluted, and synthetic spiritual perceptions, accurate spiritual perceptions. Okay. This is the faculty that receives theological knowledge also from the Church's tradition. When you read Scripture, when you read the teachings of the Fathers. Yes, our discourse of a Dianetic intellect can analyze these things, but prior to this analysis, the nous receives the words of Scripture and receives the teachings of the Fathers, receives the experience of the liturgy, receives the experience of the icons directly in a direct synthetic apperception of higher realities. And this is more sure knowledge than the results of analytical theology or analytical philosophy. Okay. But in the West, they pancake the psyche and the spirit. Right? They have a hard time distinguishing between purely psychological experiences and genuinely spiritual experiences. One very beautiful testimony to the reality of how spiritual experience is distinct from psychological experience is in the introduction to the book Russia's Catacomb Saints, which is translated by Father Seraphim Rose. The first third of the book is by a man named Ivan Mikhailovich Andreev. And Andreev was a pre-revolutionary intellectual who went through the typical process of Russian conservative Orthodox men of going from being a revolutionary youth to being an idealistic intellectual, to finally being a real Orthodox. And he recounts his experience of going to Divevo, the famous convent established by St. Seraphim, and walking in what's called a canal. It's like a dike around that St. Seraphim ordered them to build around the monastery. And the tradition was that you walked around the dike 3 times, praying, and then at the end you expressed to St. Seraphim your true desire. And he, in the process of doing this, Ivan Mikhailovich was lifted up into a completely different realm. And he knew from his studies, he was a tremendous intellectual. He knew from all of his psychological, psychiatric, medical studies, scientific studies, that this was completely different from a purely psychological experience. And when he got to the end, he said to St. Seraphim, "Take away everything, but let me always remember this moment." He perceived an experience what he had already learned from studying the Philokalia and from the teachings of the Optina elders and Paisi Velichkovsky and so forth, that the pneumatic, or as we say in Slavonic, the duchovny realm, the realm of the spirit, is much farther above or distinct from the psychic, or what in Russian they say the dushevny realm, than the psychic is from the material, from the bodily. That the psychic and the corporeal are this close, and the spiritual is this. Just very distinct. Okay. This knowledge is only kept in Orthodoxy. The Catholics have no concept of it. because of first there's the loss of grace through heresy, right? Then developing false spiritual methods and images, as we talked about with Francis of Assisi, as the beginning of that. This long, crazy drifting into all kinds of spiritual delusions. The result of bad theology, bad delusions, loss of grace, and specifically this anthropological mistake of confusing the psychic and the spiritual. Okay? So they pancake the soul and the spirit. They pancake the reason and the nous. So from this point on, this intellectual confusion creates a bad theological method, that of dialectic, okay, with primacy given to kataphasis, that is what we say about God, instead of apophasis, what we can't say about God. The Orthodox Fathers give primacy to apophasis, right? We practice isekia. We arrive at the state of as it says in the life of Saint Benedict, of learned ignorance, knowing unknowledge, right? We arrive at the very border of our capacity to understand anything, and we realize that God has to enlighten us. And that's the foundation of true theology. And after that, we can engage in kataphasis, what we are allowed to say about God. But with this emphasis on dialectic, the primacy is starting to be given to what we can say about God. And the Roman Catholics developed this idea that the whole church's whole life from now to the end of the world is an adventure in creating new theology. That's part of perfecting the church, is coming up with new dogmas. Okay? Now they'll say that new dogmas always build on the old dogmas. But it's this idea that if you're engaging in more and more kataphasis, you have a greater understanding of God. Whereas the Orthodox Fathers are saying, well, we have to be very careful. We have as little kataphasis, as little speech as necessary, and we put boundaries around the word horos in Greek, the definition that an ecumenical council issues, a horos, right? It means a boundary. That's what definitio means in Latin, right? Definitio, a boundary. The definitions of the councils, the definitions of the fathers are boundaries not around God, who cannot be bounded, right? They're boundaries around human language. And so what happens is they would certainly give lip service to apophasis. At the end of his life, Thomas Aquinas had some kind of amazing experience. I hope it was a genuine spiritual experience. He said, all my works are straw. And another thing that the Dominicans and the Catholics in general don't reveal very much is that he said, burn everything I wrote, burn it. Okay? He wasn't being poetic or being humble. Oh, burn my works, I'm not worthy. That kind of thing. No, he was serious. So Aquinas seemed to have had some kind of revelation at the end of his life that this whole project he was involved in was going in a wrong direction. Okay. So it's this emphasis of kataphasis over apophasis, of the analytic over the synthetic and tradition-based method, as well as lack of spiritual discernment. The Western saint, quote-unquote, cannot distinguish between that which is merely of the soul, which is psychic, psychological, that which is genuinely of the spirit, which is spiritual. Okay. By opening the door to endless dialectic and analysis, this confusion leads to theological unraveling. We're going to see more and more theological and philosophical unraveling as we go through this incredible story of the second millennium in the West, right? And by opening the door to endless delusory psychological experiences, the confusion leads to lack of spiritual discernment. Okay. So theological confusion, spiritual confusion. Okay. That was pancake 1. Pancake 2. They pancake the organism and the organization of the church. So the full-blown papal ideology that we talked about in our last class, climaxing in the Unum Sanctum, the famous bull by Boniface VIII in the year 1304. This full-blown papal ideology pancakes, smashes the organism of the church, her life, into the organization of the church, her outward structures. Okay? With the latter, the structures, controlling and dominating, or in worst cases, even substituting, right, for the former, for the life of the church. Okay? So if you talk to a really educated Roman Catholic who knows the teaching of his church, the old-fashioned Catholic teaching before Vatican II, he will tell you that the papacy is not really, the papacy is not a ministry in service of the church, although that's ancient title of the popes, right? Adopted by St. Gregory the Great, Servus Servorum Dei, servant of the servants of God. It's one of the many titles of the pope. Right? It was adopted by St. Gregory the Great. But they'll tell you, really, the papacy in its essence is not so much a ministry, it is an integral part of the constitution of the church. Without the papacy, there's no salvation. Without the papacy, there are no sacraments. There's no spiritual life. There's no nothing. Okay? So really, instead of the church, they have the papacy. Okay? Fundamentally, they have an organization. Okay? So how do you know, in this viewpoint, if you're operating at this viewpoint, how do you know you're in the church? Well, you're under the Pope. It's like our Orthodox friends who say, well, you have to be under a patriarch. You know, they don't realize they're talking totally anti-Orthodox talk when they say things like that. They're talking like papists. Okay? How do you know you're in the church? Well, you're under the Pope. Okay? How do you know you won't spend more time in purgatory? Well, the Pope granted you an indulgence. Right? How do you know someone's really a saint? Well, the Roman Curia. The Roman Curia is the great administrative apparatus in Rome, right, in Vatican City. Well, the Roman Curia has gone through a specific legal process and declared the person a saint. A, B, C, bang, bang, equals saint, right? So now, as we know, like getting back to our Orthodox viewpoint, as we know, we Orthodox, we do respect the ancient administrative structures. We respect our metropolitans and our patriarchates and our eparchies and all these countless structures created by the patriarchs and the popes and the emperors and councils over the centuries, right? Which corresponds so much to our own national histories as ethnic groups and so forth. Territorial synods, our ancient sees. And that's why we fight about them all the time. You know, who gets to be the metropolitan of so-and-so? How do we elect the patriarch of so-and-so, right? If we didn't care about it so much, we wouldn't be fighting about it all the time, okay? But the Orthodox have never identified the structures with the church. We know that the patriarch goes bad, or if the synod goes bad, there's always some holy father or some monastery, or there's some bishop off in a corner somewhere who's carrying on the church. Right? That's the church. That's where the church is, where the life of the church is. And all these structures, all these popes, patriarchs, synods, councils, these are outward structures. These are the shell, the protective covering to preserve the real life of the church, right? Prayer, the sacraments, mystical experience, our ascetical life, right? Our salvation. That's the point of these things. Well, in the West, they pancake them. They absolutely identify, if you're not in this organization with this Pope, you're outside the church. See? This confusion in the West will lead to the church being cynically regarded as just another competitor for earthly power. Okay? In this race to see who's going to create the new progressive, bright future of the New World Order. The New World Order is not a new idea. Right? It's going all the way back. Right? We talked about this last week, going back to this utopianism that we see in the Middle Ages. Yes.
So it's not so new.
It's not really so new, right? The New World Order is an old idea. It actually goes back to paradise, where Satan said, "Just listen to me, and you'll be gods." Okay, the New World Order, there's nothing new about it. Okay, heaven on earth, right? You'll be gods. Okay. So in the Renaissance, we're going to see the spectacle of popes marching at the head of armies. The most militant one was Julius II. You know, he loved to go around, sacking cities, killing lots of Christians. And the Pope sponsoring adventures in astrology, alchemy, usury. That's where we get the new calendar from. So the fascination of the Renaissance popes with astrology. Okay, and all this is to bring about a better life on earth, right? More material happiness, more control over nature. So that's the second pancake. They pancake the organism and organization of the church. Okay. The third pancaking is their idea of God himself. The scholastics adopted this Aristotelian idea of absolute divine simplicity. We could just call it ADS, absolute divine simplicity. And this is related to what came to be called the Palamite controversies in the 14th century. In the 1300s, we have several great councils in Constantinople, where the church definitively, for all time, defended the teachings of St. Gregory Palamas about the distinction between the essence and the energies in God, and what is the actual nature of the theophanies that the saints experienced in the Old and New Testaments. The burning bush, the pillar of fire, the pillar of cloud in the Old Testament, the Shekinah, the glory of God, Isaiah beheld in the temple, the Old Testament reading we read the other night, Vespers, for the meeting. And in the New Testament, of course, preeminently the Transfiguration. What happened there? St. Gregory of Palamas is not introducing anything new. To call this palimism is really a misnomer. The Western enemies like to call it palimism because they're acting like we created a new teaching. St. Gregory is simply summarizing what all the Holy Fathers, the consensus of all the Holy Fathers, right? Except for one person, St. Augustine, who is wrong. Okay? He's wrong by himself, all in isolation, he's wrong, and the West just follows him, running after him, poor man. Right? He gets blamed for all their mistakes.
Is it
yes.
St. Augustine who wrote the Confessions?
Yes. No. St. Augustine wrote some beautiful things. Anyway, Father Seraphim Rose calls St. Augustine the father of piety. He can really inspire you with his commentaries on the Psalms, with his confessions. His City of God is a masterful examination of human history and the falsehood of paganism and the truth of Christianity and so forth. But in his dogmatic writings about the Holy Trinity and about the nature of spiritual experience and the relationship of grace to nature, he makes a lot of key mistakes.
I read the Confessions. I guess I wasn't paying close.
No, the Confessions are beautiful. There's no harm in reading the Confessions.
Oh.
Not at all. The Confessions are not about these things I'm talking about. The Confessions are about this process of this man's conversion to Christ, and it's very beautiful. And you can safely read the Confessions. There's nothing wrong with reading the Confessions. Okay. I'm talking about his De Trinitate, about this Trinity, right? And his examination of the question of the theophanies in the Old and New Testaments, and his teachings on grace and faith and works, grace and nature, okay, which we don't have time to go into now. But my point is that in the 14th century, these councils defend the teaching of St. Gregory about the relationship of the human, of the relationship of man to God and how man knows God, right? Remember how much earlier in our class on scholastic theology, we talked about Anselm of Bec, a Benedictine abbot, or Benedictine monk, and then Archbishop of Canterbury at the beginning of the late 11th, early 12th century. And his slogan of his famous proslogion, Fides quaerens in electum, which actually, Fides quaerens in electum, puts the fathers on their head. The fathers would say intellectus, the mind quaerens fidem, the mind seeking faith, right? Understanding, man's defective understanding, seeking the perfection that comes from faith, from revelation, from the gift of grace, of faith, of knowing the truth, right? But he turns it upside down. So his idea is that faith is a leap in the dark. That's what modern man thinks, right? Faith is this leap in the dark. It's this irrational decision to believe something totally like wacky or totally unavailable to any kind of, or to any to which is unavailable any evidence or logic, right? The idea is that faith is a leap in the dark, and we have to correct this defect in faith, right? With the more sure knowledge that comes from experience and from analysis, from using reason. Okay? This, in germ, is the basic idea of the anti-hesychasts also, in the 14th century, who opposed St. Gregory Palamas. Now I'm going to get to the pancaking they did. The pancaking is in number 2 here. St. Gregory summarized centuries of the teaching of the Orthodox Fathers when he taught that theology is grounded in the direct experience of the saints. Of course, there's the actual experience of the apostles who met the Lord in the flesh, but the greatest theophany of all, right? Our Jesus Christ comes, they talk to him. But even when they met Jesus in the flesh, their nous had to be enlightened, because some people met Jesus and denied him and hated him, right? Didn't believe in him, and others met him and believed in him. So even in meeting the incarnate Word, the nous still had to operate and be enlightened to know who Jesus really is. And then, of course, in all the other theophanies that don't involve the incarnate Word in person or in his material presence on earth, the burning bush, all the theophanies of the prophets in the Old Testament, the visions of Daniel and so forth. And then in the New Testament, seeing Christ revealed on Mount Tabor in his divinity. What did they see? Okay. Were they seeing Were they using their ordinary faculties of the soul to behold a created effect where God made fireworks, so to speak, or God made holograms and special effects, okay, like proto Star Wars, okay? Here's a burning bush, here's the Red Sea parting, here's the pillar of fire, here's like fireworks coming out of Jesus Christ, I mean, forgive me for sounding flippant, but that's what St. Augustine thought. Okay? And the Western writers of the Middle Ages pick up on this. They said all these experiences of the saints are created effects. Okay? That they could not be experiencing God's essence, because God is only essence. God is actus purus. His essences and energies are absolutely the same. So there's no direct experience of God until by some miracle in the next life, zap, suddenly you have the beatific vision and you see God's essence. Okay? So the prerequisite assumption of the Holy Fathers about how the saints experience God, and St. Gregory summarizes this, is that God's essence and energies are distinct. Because the nous, the mind, the spiritual intellect, must simultaneously experience God in reality, really experience God, the uncreated, to avoid agnosticism, right? To avoid saying we don't know, but we don't experience God, right? But without experiencing the divine essence, that would result in pantheism, because if you came directly into the divine essence, you just get sucked up into it, right? Everything would be God. God would be everything. Okay? Third, this knowledge is more, not less sure than the results of imperial experience and analytical reasoning of the scientists and philosophers. The spiritual knowledge of the saints, what St. Isaac the Syrian would call the third kind of knowledge, is more sure than the results of scientific investigation or analytical reasoning. Now, the other party in Constantinople at the time, and they had a hearing. These are all Greeks arguing with each other, but some of the Greeks were following St. Gregory and the Athonite monks, and John Cantacuzenius, who became the emperor, who was a big pro-hesychast, and the others are following basically the teachings of Greek monks who'd come from Italy, and who were, because remember, southern Italy was really Greek, right? It wasn't Italian as we know of it today. Greek monks coming from Italy who've been infected by scholasticism, right? So the Latinophones, that means the Latin-minded, or the anti-hesychasts, taught the opposite on all 3 points, right? That theology is the result of applying philosophical reasoning to natural and supernatural revelation. It's what we see in nature and what we read in the Bible, right? So you apply your philosophical reasoning to nature, you apply it to the Bible, and you come up with theology. And secondly, and here's the pancaking, number 2, God is absolutely simple, actus purus. Why? Because in Aristotle's philosophy, there is essence, right, and energy. So there's potential and act.
Potential energy, kinetic energy, kind of.
And work.
And potential, if you have any potential is a defect in Aristotle's thinking, okay, because he's a natural philosopher. He's not a theologian, right? He's not a saint. So Aristotle says, well, potentiality that's not energized is a defect. Well, and God can have no defects, so God's essence must be also his energy. Okay? But that's a deduction from Aristotelian metaphysics. It's not the result of what God told Moses on Mount Sinai, or what the saints experienced, or what Jesus Christ taught. It's purely a philosophical deduction. It's a logical deduction from Aristotelian metaphysics. St. John of Damascus, in the exact exposition of the Orthodox faith, summarizes the teaching of the Greek fathers, going back at least to St. Basil, that God's essence and energies are distinct. God is above these antinomies that are posed by Aristotle in his metaphysics. God can have his pure essence and also his energies being distinct, was what from Aristotle's point of view would be unenergized essence, which from Aristotle's point of view is a defect. But in God it's pure perfection. He's above these distinctions. Okay? So God in his essence is always unknowable, even to the Virgin Mary, even to the angels. He's on this other side of this chasm of the uncreated and the created in his essence. But paradoxically, he comes to us in his energies, which are uncreated. When we experience the energies, we're experiencing God. Not a created effect, not a light show, not a hologram, but God. Okay. So, and Aquinas, actually, at one point, Aquinas takes St. John of Damascus, and he says he's wrong. And Aquinas says, how do we know he's wrong? Well, Aristotle says so. And he also says, not only that, he says, Maimonides says so. Maimonides is a medieval Jewish philosopher. Following Maimonides, we know that St. John of Damascus is wrong about the essence and the energies. So you see how even a brilliant and very cautious thinker like Thomas Aquinas, because he's in love with his construct, right, with Aristotelian, the tool of Aristotelianism has become more than a tool. It's become an enslaving construct for him that he's living inside of. Okay, so he's been going so far as to take this medieval Jewish thinker Maimonides and quoting him in favor over St. John of Damascus. And Maimonides actually is a very malevolent figure. Maimonides, the mainstream scholarship, he's this genius, this philosopher, blah blah blah, Aristotelianism, blah 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 blah. But to know the real Maimonides, you have to read the Talmud, okay, which is the book of Judaism, the commentaries on Moses by the rabbis. In Talmud, they have the original text, and then there's the Mishnah, Gemara, the older text, and they are the medieval commentators. And among the medieval commentators are people named Rashi, and also someone called the Rambam. The Rambam is Maimonides. And the Rambam says really blasphemous things against Jesus Christ and against the Christians. Okay, so Maimonides isn't this beautiful, cool humanist, who's just rediscovering Aristotle and enlightening the barbaric Europeans. He is a Talmudist, right? Who hates Jesus Christ, who hates the Christians, right? So it's very ironic. It's sad, that a great man like Thomas Aquinas would quote Maimonides in favor over John of Damascus, who's a great saint and an enlightened father. Okay, but these are the depths that you sink to, right? When you abandon tradition in favor of a dialectic method of theology that puts more trust in human philosophy than in holy tradition, the authority of the fathers, the experience of the saints. Okay. So this leap, the scholastics pancake God's essence energies into this absolute identity. And they teach that these Latinophones or anti-hesychasts in the 14th century teach that scientific and philosophical knowledge is more certain than the knowledge gained from spiritual experience. Now, they wouldn't admit to this, but St. Gregory points out that this is the logical conclusion of their teaching. At one point, St. Gregory says to Barlaam, to one of them, well, you can see, he says, you're saying that Socrates and Plato are more trustworthy than the holy apostles. So this leap from trusting the saints and trusting tradition to trusting reason will actually result in the overthrow of reason. Okay, that's the ironic thing about this. Okay? It's going to result in the humanism and worldliness that's going to characterize the Renaissance, as which we will see is not going to be an age of reason, but superstition, because, and here's the point, the undercutting of the basis for undeceived spiritual knowledge. But by undercutting the basis for undeceived spiritual knowledge, the anti-hesychasts undercut the basis for the functioning of reason itself, which is known to exist only by divine revelation. We only know that man is rational from divine revelation. Right? This is where the Orthodox parted ways with the scholastics. Okay. But at the same time, in the 14th century over in England, a man named William of Ockham is parting ways with the Orthodox and the scholastics. And the great race to the bottom of Western thought, and I hope we're at the bottom now, I hope we don't go any farther down, is off and running. Okay? So now we're going to talk about Occam and nominalism. Okay, so we're going to leave behind our three pancakes. Let's talk about nominalism, which is also a 14th century phenomenon. So we're coming around to this great villain in Richard Weaver's narrative. A few years ago we read Ideas Have Consequences by Richard Weaver. It was a wonderful class that we had on that. And Richard Weaver is talking about the fall of the West originating in the nominalism of Occam in the 14th century, in the 1300s. We have to agree with Weaver. It is a huge problem. Okay? Like anti-palimism, nominalism, though one finds it before in various authors, it really takes off like anti-palimism in the 14th century. Okay? And it takes off with the teachings of an English Franciscan named William of Occam, or O-C-K-H-A-M or O-C-C-A-M. Occam, William of Occam. While anti-palimism undercuts human knowledge indirectly by undercutting the divine human mechanism of revelation, nominalism undercuts the possibility of human knowledge directly. It goes right at it by denying the existence of what are called the universals. So we're going to explain what that means. Okay, it's actually quite simple. These are complicated things that sound, well, they sound complicated, but they're really quite, when you think about it, it's really quite simple. Okay. Occam's razor, quote unquote, is the nickname for an epistemological axiom. Epistemological means something relating to knowledge, how we know things, right? An epistemological axiom attributed to the friar William, to this man William of Occam. Very simply put, entities are not to be multiplied without necessity. If you're faced with some phenomena, and you want to explain them, keep it as simple as you can. Don't add in things that don't need to be added in. Okay. So as an assumption for scientific method, well, that's a pretty good rule, right? You keep it simple. You throw out whatever's extraneous to your hypothesis. You don't make it any more complicated than it has to be, right? A good hypothesis has elegant simplicity. You don't throw in things that don't need to be there. Okay.
That makes experimentation a lot harder.
It makes it impossible, actually, or makes it very difficult, yeah, or makes it misleading. The problem, though, is that Occam and later many other thinkers following him apply this rule to the age-old problem of the universals. And they came up with what came to be called nominalism, nameism, right? Nomen, nominis in Latin is name. Nomina are names. So nominalism is nameism. Okay? The idea that when we call two horses by the same name, horse, it's not because there's such a thing as horse-ness, which they're saying, hey, use the razor, man. You got a horse, don't say there's horse-ness too. That's too much, right? You're making this too complicated. Okay? So nominalism says there's no such thing as horse-ness that the horses have in common. It's something that we've noticed these two things are kind of the same. So for convenience sake, so we don't have to build like one kind of stable or find one kind of horse food, right? We're going to call them horse for convenience, or to do, or for that matter, to do taxonomy or whatever your project is. Okay. So now let's back up. What is this so-called problem of the universals? I heard a funny saying in a lecture I watched last night on this, and the lecturer said, a philosopher is someone who takes something we take for granted and makes it a problem. So, but of course, he was being facetious, because of course we really do have to deal with these things, right? A good philosopher is someone who takes the ordinary and makes it reveals the wisdom, right, in the ordinary, right, so that we can live, right? We can live better. Okay. So what's a universal? It's very simple. A universal is anything predicated of more than one individual. Here's Kati. Here's Christina. They're both women. Okay. Woman, are they both human beings? Human being is predicated of both these individuals. Now, I don't see any third thing like in between you, humanness. Right? I see it in you. The question is it really there or not? And where is it? Is it only in you, or is it also somewhere else? Okay. Man, for example, is predicated of Peter and Paul. The problem is this. Does the word man signify something that really exists? Or is it just a notion, a tag, a name? That's nominalism, right? That we apply to two individuals pragmatically for convenience sake. Is there such a thing as human nature? Or is that just a notion a linguistic convention we can change at will. Yes.
So now he seems to be questioning the reality of absolutely everything.
Exactly. It ends up questioning the reality of everything.
It's like we're living in the Matrix and we have to question everything if it's real.
Right. Well, we are living in the Matrix now. Transgenderism is based on this, right?
Yes.
A man is a male is whatever you want to call it. A woman's whatever you want to call it. Right. Mm-hmm. So, is there such a thing as a nature of anything? Remember, for our ancestors, when they said nature, before the modern science period, the period of worshiping science, right, scientism, in the old days, in medieval times, traditional cultures, when they said a nature, they didn't mean nature in the sense of all of creation or the animals and the birds and bees. A nature was something you had that made you what you are. There's human nature, there's chair nature, there's bug nature, there's sky nature. Right? Natures were real. A nature is something real, a real substance that makes someone what he is. Okay? And it's knowable. Okay? So, is there such a thing as a nature of anything? Okay? There are three possible answers. Okay? There's nominalism. Nominalism is the idea that the universals are just names, nomina, that we give to individual substances that seem to be kind of the same. There's no such thing out there as human nature or horse nature or house nature or star nature or any kind of nature or divine nature for that. Okay. But now the opposite of nominalism is extreme realism. Like here, when we use realism here, we're not talking about nowadays they will be realistic, by which they mean be pragmatic or be practical or something. By realism we mean the accepting that the natures are real, that nature, the universals are real. Okay. Now, extreme realism is the teaching of Plato. Okay. Plato combats this idea of nominalism. That's why Plato is often the wake-up call to many sensitive or intelligent people who live in our culture. They don't know why it's so messed up. They're just drowning in all this materialism. They read Plato, and even they're far yet from coming to God or coming to Christ. But they read Plato, and suddenly they're awakened. Like there's something beyond this world. There's something real about the ideals that I instinctively feel that we should have. Okay, so Plato combats this idea, which obviously leads to skepticism, cynicism, and the abuse of power. And he associates this idea of nominalism with Socrates' opponents, the sophists, who don't care about truth. They're just using words to gain power, to make money. And that's why they hated him so much, why they framed him and had him executed. Okay? So Plato combats this idea of nominalism with a radically opposite idea. The universals are so real that they have a separate existence in the world of forms, taidi. Toidos in Greek is one, taidi, the plural, or taede for our classical pronunciation friends. The world of the forms. When we perceive humanness, according to Plato, our mind is experiencing anamnesis, remembering again. Ana is again, mnesis, remembrance, right? Where we get the word mnemonic and so forth. Remembering again the true world in which our souls pre-existed. Remember, this is Plato, not Christianity. Although Origen goes along with this, which is why one of the reasons why the poor man's a heretic. Remember again the true world in which our souls pre-existed before being imprisoned in the flesh. And imprisoned in this delusory world of matter, right? Which is very defective, which doesn't really embody the forms perfectly. But of course, with Plato, there's a soteriological problem, a problem about salvation. Okay? When you leave your body and re-enter the world of the forms, how does your humanness encounter humanness, this form out there, right? Without being absorbed by it, right? That's the real humanness. So to be fulfilled, well, you'd be absorbed by it because your humanness is defective, right? It's only partial. So you're going to be absorbed. So this idea of Plato is really close to the idea in Hinduism or the Eastern religions, right? That salvation, quote unquote, is absorption into the world soul, into the ultimate good, and so forth. Okay? It's definitely not Christianity. Then there's moderate realism. Okay? Moderate realism is the solution of Aristotle. which in its modified form is taught by the Holy Fathers as well as the scholastics. And remember, Aristotle isn't this huge bad guy. When we're criticizing the scholastics for their misuse of Aristotle, we're not saying Aristotle is all bad. The Holy Fathers are using Aristotle constantly. But they're using Aristotle's insights and terminology properly. They're not imprisoning Holy Tradition within Aristotle, which is what the scholastics did. Why Aquinas ends up correcting St. John of Damascus by quoting Maimonides. Okay. So moderate realism is the position that the universals do exist. There are natures, right? We can know them. Okay. But in the created world, they exist only as instantiated in individual instances. There's not some kind of invisible humanist walking around out there that we can't see. There's only humanists in Theodore, humanists in Christina, humanists in Ekaterina, humanists in Father Stephen. But it's really there. It's a real thing. But it's always encountered as being instantiated in an individual instance. And we can perceive it. When we perceive it, we're perceiving something that's real. We are accurately perceiving it. Now, actually, this is the basis of all science. So the whole scientific project since the Renaissance has really been based on the assumption of moderate realism being true, but to be politically correct, they're always claiming nominalism is true. Why? Because they're immoral. They're immoral people. And to justify their immorality and their lack of faith in God, they claim nominalism is true, but all the time they're doing this incredible science which can only be based on the assumption of the knowability of natures.
Hypocrisy.
It's vast hypocrisy. Right? Humanist does exist, but we see it only in examples like Peter and Paul, not in itself, right? Not humanists walking around somewhere. Okay. But where did our minds get these ideas? Right? Where did it come from? Why are we able to perceive the universals? The answer is most beautiful. It's most satisfying. Because our minds are made according to the image of the Logos, of the primordial mind, in which are found the logi, the archetypes or patterns of all created things. The universals aren't their own things, like in Plato, right? They're ideas in the mind of God. Now the scholastics, with their beloved ADS, their absolute divine simplicity, their pancake, right? They have a hard time explaining why the logi are not created or eternal archetypes with an existence separate from God, which would throw them back into some kind of Platonism, or even, if the archetypes are uncreated, polytheism. And they have a hard time explaining that if the logi really do pertain to the mind of God, considered as pure essence, how they're not necessarily just notions in our own minds, which would throw them back into some kind of nominalism. The scholastics really can't, for all their hatred of nominalism, they really can't, with their ADS, they really can't explain satisfactorily the logi, right? The archetypes. But the Holy Fathers, by contrast, most notably St. Maximus the Confessor, can explain the logi easily, okay, as being posited in the realm of the uncreated energies of the Logos. But both the Orthodox and the Scholastics, both the Orthodox and the quote-unquote Roman Catholics, oppose nominalism. And really, all traditionalists, all conservative thinkers in the history of Western thought oppose nominalism, because they know that if you believe in nominalism, you can't really know anything, you can't pursue truth, and life is based on dog eat dog. Just a lust for power. Because there's no truth, right? So we're going to see how the skepticism engendered by nominalism will infect every aspect of religion, philosophy, politics, and culture in the Renaissance and succeeding ages. Okay. If you cannot know the natures of things as they really are, okay, then real knowledge is impossible. And the pursuit of science is not to conform to the mind to reality and the passions to the mind, right? To control the passions by the mind. And the mind is controlled, the mind is humbled before reality. The mind is humbled and says, I've got to conform myself to reality. I don't make reality. I conform my mind to reality. And when my mind knows the truth, I subjugate the lower faculties of my soul, my passions, to the mind which knows truth. Okay? That's a truly human life. Okay? But if you accept nominalism, you have this satanic inversion where you conform reality to the demands of your will, dominated by the passions. Okay. This satanic inversion, and I'm about to say something very drastic and very terrible, but we can't avoid it. This satanic inversion is the basis of all modern culture, which is a sobering thought that should really motivate us to stay out of the mainstream and off the radar screen and really stay close to the church. Okay. Orthodoxy is really different. It's really different. And so we're going to talk, I've just made a very radical claim, and we're going to talk about this, and we're going to see this. As we go through the Renaissance, we go through the Enlightenment, we go through the Revolutionary period, we're going to see how this plays out. And it's going to make us, first of all, be very, very grateful that we're Orthodox. And very grateful that we're in the shelter of the church. Because what's been going on in the West, and I love the West, I'm a Westerner, I'm an Anglo-Frenchman, okay? I love my ancestors, I love the good things about this culture, but we have to realize this vast project going on since the 14th century has been a flight into fragmentation, into lesser and lesser true knowledge, but greater and greater power of man over matter, which has given man the illusion that he's God, and encouraged terrible oppression, terrible destruction of other people. Okay? So we'll see this we're going to see this as we go along. So those are some foundational ideas behind that give birth to the era of the Renaissance, and we're going to go more into the Renaissance next week.